place all over the globe. Danny nodded encouragingly. Good. Martin warmed to his theme. Also he plans pretty meticulously. And he seems to have a knack for handling complicated security systems. Makes me suspect has an electrical engineer or a computer whiz of some sort. The security angle had always bothered Danny. Thinking of the Jakes case, he remembered that the alarm system at 420 Loma Vista had been highly sophisticated, state-of-the-art in its day. The Henleys had a straightforward but reliable Benham system in London, and Didier Anjou's Saint-Tropez home was surrounded by CCTV cameras, all of them suspiciously blank the night of his murder. According to Inspector Liu of the Hong Kong police, Miles Baring had installed a security system to rival the one at Fort Knox. And yet in all 4 cases, a single man had slipped in and out of the victims' homes entirely unnoticed. A killer with unusual expertise in matters of technology was one possibility. But there was another, simpler one that had haunted Danny since his days on the Jakes case. Maybe someone in the household knew the killer, he said out loud. Someone let them in. A servant or something. Or the wives. Claude Martin boldly stated what Danny couldn't bring himself to utter. Here's a theory. This killer, this sophisticated, intelligent guy, targets the bored young wives of his victims. He grooms them, winning their trust, maybe seducing them sexually. Then, once he has them under his spell, he cons them, persuading them to give all their husbands' money away to charity. Then what? Danny asked skeptically. He breaks into their homes. Why not? By then he already has inside knowledge of the property, security codes, camera positions, etc. He conceals his identity with a mask, does something with his voice presumably so the women don't recognize him. Murders the husbands. Rapists the wives. Then he returns later as the shoulder to cry on for the widows. Once the money's safely in the accounts of the charities, he persuades the widows to disappear with him. Safely removed from the crime scene, he kills them too, disposes of the bodies and moves on to the next hit. All 3 men were silent. Martin's theory was a serious stretch on many levels. Assuming that the killer attempted to disguise himself at the time of the break-in, was it actually possible that a woman would fail to recognize her own lover? It seemed pretty far-fetched. And wouldn't the cops have come across the killer in his shoulder-to-crown guise? Surely if some slick, presumably handsome, intelligent young man was hanging around the victims. Danny froze. There had been such a man. With Angela Jakes. Hanging around her like a bad smell. Lyle Rinaldo. Martin was talking again, enjoying his newfound role as Sherlock Holmes. Stuck in a forensics lab at Interpol, he rarely got a chance to let his imagination run wild. Or we could consider some alternatives. How about this? The killer does not conceal his identity. The wives know full well who he is and they let him into their homes deliberately. The wives aren't his victims. They're his accomplices. Danny Maguire thought back to Angela Jacquet's terrible injuries after her rape. She was so badly beaten that when he first saw her, tied to her husband's corpse, had thought she was dead. He shook his head. No. No way. There was nothing faked about those rappers. Not the one I saw, anyway. Not in a million years was that sex consensual. Claude Martin raised an eyebrow. Americans could be dreadful prudes when it came to sex. Are you sure? Some women like it rough. Not that rough, said Danny. Not that woman. She was so sweet and gentle. An angel. Martin shrugged. Don't forget there were hundreds of millions of dollars at stake in each of these killings. People will tolerate extreme suffering to obtain enormous amounts of money. But none of the widows kept the money. They gave it away. Except Lisa Baring. Except Lisa Baring. So far. Silence fell again. Martin's theory was plausible. One killer. Possibly Lyle Rinaldo? Grooming wives. Gaining access. Killing husbands. Diverting funds. Of course it still begged a number of questions. Not the least of which was why. Danny said, motive's still a problem. Richard Sturi laughed loudly. It was the first sound had made in a good 15 minutes and both Danny and Claude Martin turned to stare at him in surprise. Motive's a problem? Everything's a problem. You haven't a shred of hard factual evidence to support any of what you've just said. The German's tone was contemptuous. His French colleague instantly bridled. All right, then, Albert Einstein. Let's hear what you've got to say about the crimes. Wordlessly, Richard Stury removed his sleek Sony laptop from its case and placed it on the table. As he lovingly stroked its cover, Danny had a sudden image of Blofeld, from the Austin Powers movies, with his cat. This is just some initial analysis. Very basic. Danny Maguire and Claude Demartin both gazed at the screen in awe. The graphs lit up the screen one by one in an array of eye-popping colors. Red for the Jakes murder, blue for the Henley case, green for Anjou, and livid purple for the Berings. There were timelines showing the length of time between the date of each marriage and the respective husband's murder, and from each murder to the wife's disappearance. Bar graphs analyzing everything from the age gap between each couple to the geographical distance between the crimes. Richard Stury had done his homework and then some. On the last screen, in yellow, was another, as yet untitled set of graphs. Danny pointed at them. What are those? Projections. Not conjecture, you understand. Stury looked at Demartin with an expression hovering between pity and contempt. Mathematical probabilities, drawn from the limited known facts. I've been building up a profile of the killer based on past data. The yellow lines predict his statistically probable next move. Danny swallowed hard. You mean his next kill? Precisely. It occurs to me that the most effective way for us to assist our member country in actually apprehending this individual would be to anticipate his next move and prepare for it. Of course, we can't say who specifically his next victim will be. But we can predict that individual's age, net worth, geographical location, most likely wedding date. There is a plethora of factors that can be statistically determined, telling us how the killer will behave in the future based on how he has behaved in the past. Danny stared at the jagged yellow lines and for some reason thought of the Wizard of Oz. Is that how we are going to find him? By following Stury's yellow brick road. Perhaps we've had the answers all along, like Dorothy and her friends. We just didn't know where to look. Beneath the graphs were numbers, pages and pages of them. Statistical analysis of everything from the DNA evidence, to the dates of the bank transfers, to comparative data about each of the children's charities, to the 4 victims' dates of birth. A sea of numbers that all but made Danny's eyes cross. Richard Stury concluded, in my opinion, it is a poor use of our limited time and resources to focus on who the killer might be and why he does what he does. We simply do not have enough factual evidence to answer those questions. This data tells us how he operates, when and where he kills. Look here. Stury flashed between screens so fast that Danny saw nothing but a blurry rainbow. The rate at which he commits his crimes appears to be increasing rapidly. No appears about it, said Danny. Nothing happened for 4 years after the Jakes case, but the Baring murder occurred a year after Didier Anjou's. Ah. But you were assuming that Sir Piers Henley was his first kill after Andrew Jakes. Demartin's eyes widened. You think there was another murder in between? One that we don't know about? I don't think anything. Thinking's not my job. But statistically, such a case is likely, yes. Probably in South America, in 1998 or early 1999. I'm looking into it. Geez. Danny whistled. Okay. Go on. He kills every 2 to 3 years, moving east around the globe, changing his identity, and possibly his appearance, between each strike. He is highly intelligent and a skilled manipulator. The age difference between his victims and their wives is dropping an average of 5 years with each murder. The victims are getting younger. No. The wives are getting older. Us, of course, is our killer. Danny thought about this, grasping for something that had eluded him up to now. The age thing felt significant, but he didn't know why. After a long silence, he asked, do you think the wives are dead? Richard Stury hesitated. Probably. There is no plausible reason, at least none that I can think of, for him to keep them alive. Except for Lisa Baring, Demartin said again. Except for Lisa Baring. How Danny wished Matt Daly had gotten further with Mrs. Baring. Had picked a hell of a time to drop off the radar. Okay. Division of labor. As you know, we've only been allotted 8 hours per week of official work time on Azrael. We all have other cases that need our attention, so I don't want to overload you. Richard, I want you to keep doing what you're doing. But nothing goes directly onto the I-24/7 database. Any stats and projections connected with this investigation come to me first. Understood? The German raised an eyebrow but nodded his consent. Delaying the inputting of data onto Interpol systems was highly irregular. But not as irregular as disobeying a direct instruction from a superior officer. Claude, for now I need you to focus on forensics. See if there's anything in the semen, blood or fingerprint analysis that the local police missed. Yes, sir. If you don't mind my asking, what will you be working on? I'm going to make a few inquiries in Los Angeles, said Danny. There's a man there I'd like to talk to again. An attorney by the name of Lyle Rinaldo. Inspector Liu could not reach Assistant Director Danny Maguire. According to Maguire's secretary, an obstructive French matron named Mathilde, Maguire was at a meeting and was not expected back in the office for some time. So much for Interpol's promised 24/7 support. Irritated, Liu left a message. Mrs. Baring had a lover whom they now suspected of involvement in her husband's murder. Asuch, Mrs. Baring herself was now a suspect in the investigation. She remained in Bali, and photographic evidence suggested that this man was staying with her there. Could Assistant Director Maguire organize an Interpol response team to help Liu and his men gain access to the villa and, if necessary, arrest the suspects? The Indonesian authorities were being less than helpful. Hanging up, Liu looked at his watch. 4 p.m., Hong Kong time. If he didn't hear from Maguire by morning, he'd take matters into his own hands. Céline Maguire was not a happy woman. She was not happy because the bœuf bourguignon she had so painstakingly cooked for her husband had been reduced to a viscous, charred mass at the bottom of a casserole dish. She was not happy because she'd done her hair and put on her prettiest dress, all for nothing. She was not happy because all the excuses Danny was about to give her for his lateness would be lies, but she was too frightened to challenge him with the truth. Angela Jakes was back in their lives. Sometimes Céline likened Angela Jakes to a mistress. Pretty pathetic to be jealous of a woman your husband has never made love to and never will, a woman who's almost certainly dead. This time around, Céline saw Angela more as an addiction, like alcohol or crystal meth or a glistening white line of freshly cut cocaine. After 5 happy years, Danny had fallen off the wagon. The addict's lies had already started. Fremont called me into a meeting. Meth is off sick, so I got stuck with a load of paperwork. The ERT division's up for a review next month. I'm gonna have to put in some extra hours. Céline had checked out each story, but she already knew what she'd find. If you want to lie through your teeth, Danny, you shouldn't have married a fellow detective. He hadn't even had the balls to tell her that a new investigation, Azrael, had been authorized, still less that he was heading the team. But if Danny's lies were laughably transparent, Celine's own tactics were just as risible. Fancy meals. Date nights. Sexy clothes. As if she stood a chance against his addiction. Against Angela. Sorry I'm late. Danny burst through the door, a stack of files under one arm and a bursting at the seams briefcase under the other. You didn't cook, did you? What do you think? Snapped Céline, glancing over her shoulder at the smoky remains of the beef. Danny looked stricken. I'm sorry, honey. You should have told me. I should have told you. I should have told you. She stormed past him, an angry flash of red silk, grabbing her coat from the peg by the door on her way out. Fuck you, Danny. And fuck Azrael. Before Danny could say another word, she was gone. Azrael. So she knows already. Shit. His instinct was to go after her, but he knew from experience that when Céline was this mad she needed space. Anything he said to her now would only fan the flames of her wrath. Wearily, he set down his work on the kitchen table. It had been a long, draining, fruitless afternoon. Had spent most of it on the phone to Ella, tracking down every lead and calling in every favor he could think of in an effort to get hold of Lyle Rinaldo. But no one had seen or heard of the guy since 1997. He quit his law practice in that year apparently, barely 12 months after Andrew Yacker's murder and 10 since Angela's disappearance. the same year Danny left town himself. According to colleagues, Lyle was supposed to be taking up a new position back in New York. He was from the city originally, but Danny could find no trace of him in any of the public records databases he checked there. Phone and utility bills, DMV, Social Security Administration, had drawn a blank. Of course it was early days. But key players in the Jake's investigation had an uncanny tendency to evaporate into thin air just when Danny wanted to talk to them. Already the old feelings of frustration and helplessness and despair had started to return. Back in LA in the 90s, Danny had felt as if the truth he was seeking was a wet bar of soap, in his grasp one moment, but slipping through his fingers the next. Was that how it was going to be with Azrael? He wondered for a moment who had spilled the beans about the investigation to Celine, then let it go. What did it matter, really? He should have told her himself. Now she would never understand, never forgive him. Unless I solve the case quickly. Unless I succeed this time, catch this bastard and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. After a hastily made supper, the brilliant jambon baguette washed down with ice-cold Sam Adams, the French did a lot of things right but beer wasn't one of them. He began working through his mountain of notes. It was almost 10 before he got as far as checking his voicemails. 3 were internal memos about budgeting, 1 was a lead on a case his division was working on in Bogota, and the 5th was from his mother in LA asking if had remembered his grandmother's 90th birthday. He hadn't. But it was the 6th, and final message, from Inspector Liu, that made the hairs on Danny's arm stand on end. Lisa Baring had a lover. All of a sudden Dem Artin's wild theory wasn't looking so way out there anymore. Was it Lyle Rinaldo, all these years later, using a different name and identity? Had be older, of course, in his late 40s by now, but he was probably still attractive enough to lure a lonely, bored young housewife into his net. Liu said something about him staying at the Bering Spali villa. If it were true, if there was even a chance of it being true, they couldn't let him slip away again. He thought about calling Liu back, but decided it could wait. What if Rinaldo, or whoever it was packing his bags right now, and Lisa's? Spiriting her away so he could kill her like he had the others? Liu had asked for help with the local Balinese police, and that's what Danny was going to give him. Danny dialed the number for the Interpol switchboard. I need clearance for an operation in Bali. Put me through to the chief of police in Jakarta. Inspector Liu checked his BlackBerry. Still no word from Leon. Interpol could go fuck itself, and so could the Indonesians. This is my investigation. I'm done asking for permission. The call to Indonesia did not go well. They had not requested Interpol assistance and knew nothing about the Azrael murders. The Hong Kong police had already made a nuisance of themselves, harassing private citizens on Indonesian territory. Having failed to observe the basic courtesies, Inspector Liu now had the audacity to demand their cooperation, asking them to issue an arrest warrant despite having provided no evidence of any criminal activity by anybody at Villa Mirage. Inspector Liu and Interpol could stick their demands where the sun didn't shine. Depressed, Danny returned to his mountainous to-do list, but his heart wasn't in it. Maybe he should call Celine. She still wasn't home, which was unlike her. After a fight, she typically stormed off for a few hours, then came home a few glasses of wine later, ready for a screaming match and some passionate make-up sex. Pushing the paperwork to one side, a fax cover sheet slipped out of the file. Danny noticed that it was also from Liu's office in Hong Kong. How had he missed it earlier? Behind the cover sheet was a scanned photograph. It was black and white and grainy. Clearly it had been taken from some distance. It showed a man and a woman on a balcony, embracing. Danny looked at the men closely, scanning what little he could see of his features for any resemblance to Lyle Rinaldo. It was impossible. The picture quality was too poor. Although there was something familiar about the image. The shape of the head, the stance as the man extended his hand toward the woman, Mrs. Baring presumably, the way that the facial features looked stretched out, almost as if he were cracking a hooga smile. Danny's stomach lurched. Oh my God. No. It can't be. Shaking, he picked up the phone.